Good to go?
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. All right, so I'm Bethany Seekman. All right, cool. All right, so do you want to mute, Mom?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. All right, let's try this again. All right, so I'm Bethany Seekman, and this is my 15-minute teaching video for level 2 aromatherapist stuff. I'm going to be talking about botany and the way that botany is actually classified, because I find it really fascinating that you can have plants that don't seem like they should go together, but they're actually classified the same way through the various classification systems for botany taxonomy. So yeah, that's what my teaching video is going to be on. We're going to see how this goes. So I've taken several botany classes before this. When I was in college, it's kind of part of being an environmental scientist. And I always found it super fascinating how you have plants that don't seem like they should match, but they're in the same family. And for those of you who don't know, I'm going to quickly go over the way like all plants, animals, insects, invertebrates, fungus, all that sort of stuff is classified. So you have various levels, starting with kingdom. So kingdom, that's going to be like, you have your animal kingdom, your plant kingdom. Then you have phylum, which is a little bit more specific. So I remember it by Kids Play Crash on Freeway Go Smash. That's the way I remember kingdom, phylum, class, and I can't even remember, order, family, genus, species. So genus and species, those are the two most specific. As Leanne likes to say, that's like the first and last name. Well, it's really, genus is like the last name of the plant, and species is the first name of the plant. So that's like as specific as you get when it comes to taxonomy. So like humans are Homo sapiens, but also in the Homo family group is other types of primates, for example. So when we study botany, the broadest level that we look at is family. So that's like, trying to think of a good equivalent. So it would be like, my name's Bethany Seekman, but I'm part of the Dunning clan. So that would be like my family, with Seekman being then my genus and Bethany being my species. So that's like a super basic way of thinking about it. And some people would also throw in domain at the very top, so domain kingdom, but that's way more specific than most amateur or average scientists even care about looking at. So we studied all of the plant families that essential oils that we were studying came from. So for some, we only had 1 or 2 oils in it. For others, we have numerous. So for example, you have Rutaceae, which is your citrus. So that's going to have multiple, and that's fairly obvious how it all matches together because it's all your citrus. It's all bergamot, grapefruit, lemon, green mandarin, red mandarin, neroli, orange. So all of your classic, what we all think of as citrus. And so that they all got grouped together by the fact that they produce fruits with hard peels. Is how the Rutaceae family is separated out from everything else. But then you have more complex ones like the Lamiaceae family, which has basil, clary, sage, lavender, marjoram, oregano, patchouli, peppermint, spearmint, rosemary, and thyme. Typically, this family is classified as the mint family, which is really a misnomer because there's a lot of other plants that aren't mint. So that's kind of what got me thinking about, like, looking at it specifically, how did plants like clary sage and basil get put together into the same group? And like I said, I had a little bit of background of plant taxonomy, but I wanted to look into it a little bit more. And I figured if I was curious about it, there had to be someone else in the class who was curious about how you could have patchouli and spearmint in the same family group. So with that being said, we're gonna do a little bit of history because that's the easiest way to explain it. So the taxonomy that I referenced of the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species was developed in the mid 1700s by Carl Linnaeus. Most of us who studied science at some point or some sort of biology probably recognize the name. He's kind of the first person to take what people have been studying and actually start looking at how do we make this simpler of naming things, because pre him it would be like white flower on green stem with 3 leaves found in Bath, England. That would be how you would classify it. So you classify it like by what it looked like, who found it, where you found it, and then you ended up with the same flower being described 5 different ways and not realizing it was the same plant. So you would have, for example, jasmine being described in India one way and in England one way, but it was the same plant, but they were looking at it like it was 2 different plants. So Linnaeus decided to come up with a simpler and more common streamlined way of naming and classifying plants. So he's the one who created like the genus, species naming of plants. So you went from the really big, long descriptive to each one had 2 words to describe it. Back then, you didn't really have the same like common vernacular for naming things. So all your botanists used the Latin names that he kind of started. And he started by naming and classifying plants based off of how they reproduced. So the reproductive structures in plants and flowers are stamen and pistils. And so he started classifying based on the number of stamens and pistils found within the flowers of plants. But that got complicated really fast because now you're having to look at really little flowers and really little parts on really little flowers. And future botanists were like, well, can we come up with additional ways to start looking at things? And that's where it starts to get complicated, because instead of naming like in the animal kingdom where it's pretty streamlined of you have all your primates, you have all of your birds, you have all of your fish, it's very obvious how they're broken up. In the botanical world, you very quickly had multiple classification systems being developed to name plants and classify them in different ways. So different families are organized based on different classification systems. So there are 3 main classification systems that are commonly used and studied alongside the Linnaeus system of classification, because he's kind of the backbone of all taxonomists use the Linnaeus system for classification. So the first one, which is the most common used, and it plays off of Linnaeus looking at the reproductive structure, is the Bessey system, which is where you get the terms monocots and dicots. So he's looking specifically at flowering plants. So that's going to be anything that flowers. So those are called angiosperms. And basically, when the plant starts to sprout from its seed, you have a monocot that sprouts with one single seed leaf, and then a dicot that has a double seed leaf. And he noticed that if you looked at that, and then you looked at the physical characteristics of those plants as they matured, monocots had the same characteristics across the board, and dicots have the same characteristics across the board. So monocots typically have parallel veins, and their flowers have parts of 3. So whether that's 6 petals, so that would be 2 groups of 3, or 3 stamen, 3 pistils, that everything was by 3. And then dicots had not nice parallel veins. If you looked at the leaf, they're kind of webby, and as the phrase is net veins. And their flower parts were found in groupings of 4 or 5. So that's an easy way for us, if we're looking at a flowering plant, to figure out, is this a monocot or a dicot? Because we don't necessarily know what the seed looked like when it first sprouted. Is you can look at the veins and the number of parts. So that then at least divided a little bit better than just trying to count how many stamen and pistils there were. You could kind of be like, okay, this is a monocot, this is a dicot. From there, you continue to get more detailed, and you have the ray system, which is one of my favorite ways of classifying stuff, because you start looking at the more specifics. So you now know, okay, this is a monocot, this is a dicot, but how do we break the monocots and the dicots now? Farther down, sorry. So he started looking at, what do the fruits look like when fruit is produced? So that's how, for example, you have the Rutaceae family. The fruits all look very similar. You have the hard peel, and then the segmented fleshy parts. And then he further, for the ones that didn't necessarily produce obvious fruit, he further subdivided by flower and leaf features. So for example, you can have, like in the mint family, square and hairy stems is one of the features that you can find in a mint family, versus like the round, super pretty stems that aren't hairy. So stuff like that, of breaking it down just a little bit farther so that you can get more detailed, instead of just having, oh, here's one big group of monocots, here's one big group of dicots. So those 2 systems, and I was wrong, I said 3 earlier, it's actually just 2. Those 2 systems are the major ones that are used, but then from there, more botanists came along and just kept adding to it and starting to go further and further into detail. So looking at the complexity of the flower. So how does the flower bloom? How many petals? Those sorts of very specific things. The type of fruit, the anatomy, like the internal anatomy of the flower. So kind of going back to Linnaeus of looking at the pistils and stamens, but then some flowers, you do have male flowers and female flowers. And so that's a separate group than the ones that have both the stamen and the pistils together, and kind of looking at the smaller mechanics. And then you eventually get to the current system, which is a combination of all the systems that looks at 3 main factors to classify down into your family groups. And so that's going to be the anatomy. So that's, how does it look? So like I said, hairy square stems. How many leaves do the stems produce? How big are the flowers? How small are the flowers? Is it a vine? Is it a grass? Is it a tree? All of those things. And then you also look at the reproductive structures. And then finally, the type of fruit and the way the seeds are produced. So that's kind of a very broad look at botany classification. And as I was looking more into it, I realized that it gets more and more complicated because no one seems to agree on what is the best way to classify it. And then people come up with better options, but we already are used to putting certain plants all together into one thing. So why change something that's not broken? Let's just make it even more specific. And that's it.